What if I told you the palace has just detonated the single most dangerous bombshell in royal history? Not another rumor, not another piece of tabloid gossip. Actual evidence, official proof, that Meghan Markle never carried the children she claimed were born of her body. For years, people whispered. For years, the questions simmered in the background, dismissed as cruel or conspiratorial. But now the whispers have transformed into thunder, and Harry and Meghan are the ones choking on the storm. Picture it. A young couple who built their entire freedom brand on family values, love conquering all, and the story of two miracle pregnancies. Two bouncing babies wrapped in fairy tale imagery, presented to the world as symbols of their love. And yet, behind the smiling photographs, behind the glossy Netflix documentaries, behind the endless speeches about authenticity, something was always off. Too many inconsistencies, too many slip-ups, too many moments when the image didn't match reality. You saw it. We all saw it. And now the palace has confirmed what millions suspected, but no one dared to declare publicly. Meghan's pregnancies were smoke and mirrors. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Why does this matter now? Because the timing isn't random. The palace didn't just wake up one morning and decide to humiliate Harry and Meghan. This was a calculated move, a carefully chosen moment. Think about it. The monarchy is under pressure. King Charles's reign is still finding its footing. Prince William is preparing for his eventual ascension. And Harry and Meghan, even thousands of miles away in California, continue to make noise, to destabilize, to drain sympathy and headlines. So the palace pulled out their nuclear weapon, the truth they had locked away for years. The story you're about to hear is not just about surrogacy. It's about control, about betrayal, about the dangerous power of secrets when they collide with public image. Because let's face it, without the narrative of Meghan the doting mother, without the photos of a glowing pregnant duchess clutching her belly on tour, the entire Sussex fairy tale begins to crumble. If Meghan wasn't the one carrying those children, what else wasn't real? What other parts of their brand were crafted illusions? And here's the question you need to ask yourself right now. Why was this kept hidden for so long? Why cover up something as significant as the origins of Archie and Lilibet? Was it protection for the children, or protection for Meghan and Harry's carefully manufactured image? Let's rewind. Remember those odd moments when Meghan's bump seemed to shrink, grow, or even shift unnaturally as she bent down? Clips went viral on social media. Skeptics accused her of wearing a moon bump, a prosthetic belly. Defenders claimed it was just camera angles or maternity fashion. At the time, the palace said nothing. They didn't defend her, but they didn't deny anything either. Silence can sometimes scream louder than words. But behind that silence, according to sources, there was already unease. Doctors, records, insiders, all privy to details the public couldn't see. The palace allegedly had access to information Meghan thought she could control forever. And yet, they waited. They sat on it. Because that's how the monarchy operates. They hoard secrets until the right moment to use them. So why now? Because Harry and Meghan pushed too far. They weaponized victimhood. They accused the royals of racism, cruelty, neglect. They sold their story to Oprah, to Netflix, to Spotify, making millions while dragging the crown through the mud. Every accusation they leveled chipped away at the monarchy's credibility. And now, the monarchy has answered back, with the one truth that flips the narrative entirely. Do you see the irony? Meghan, who made motherhood central to her identity, now exposed as having never carried the very children she paraded before the cameras. Harry, who vowed to protect his wife and children from the cruelty of the press, now powerless to shield them from the cruelty of the palace itself. The very institution he fled has now twisted the knife in the deepest wound imaginable. Think about Harry right now. Imagine the humiliation, the heartbreak, the rage. A man who once told the world he was thrilled to be a father, blindsided by the fact that his private truth is no longer private. Meghan's tears, Harry's silence. It's the stuff of Shakespearean tragedy. Only this is playing out in real time, before the eyes of millions. And here's where the story gets even darker. Because if the palace has the medical evidence that Meghan never carried, that means someone else did. A surrogate, possibly more than one. And with that revelation comes a tsunami of questions. Who was she? Where was she? Was she compensated in silence? bound by ironclad contracts never to reveal the truth? What does this mean for Archie and Lilibet's place in the royal lineage? If Meghan never carried them, how does the public view their legitimacy? We are talking about the future of children here, innocent children, caught in the crossfire of scandal. Their birth certificates, their titles, their right to be recognized as true heirs of the Sussex line, all now overshadowed by suspicion. And make no mistake, the palace knows this. They didn't release this proof to inform the public. They released it to annihilate the Sussex brand, once and for all. But here's the kicker. Meghan saw this coming. She always knew the secret could one day leak. It's why she fought so hard to control her image, to silence critics, to sue publications. She lived in fear of this very moment. And now it's here. You might be wondering, why would the palace risk hurting children just to strike at Harry and Meghan? Because in their world, perception is everything. The monarchy survives on image. And Meghan's surrogacy secret, if left hidden, gave her power. She could wield it against them, knowing they'd never dare expose it. By ripping the bandage off themselves, the palace reclaims the narrative. It's brutal. It's ruthless. It's royal politics at its most vicious. And if you think this revelation is explosive, wait until you hear what came next. Because the release of proof wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a much bigger war. The war over who controls the truth, who controls the narrative, and who ultimately controls the legacy of Archie and Lilibet. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The whispers never really went away, did they? From the very first announcement of Meghan's pregnancy with Archie, there were raised eyebrows. People noticed things. Subtle things at first. Her baby bump seemed to change shape depending on the angle. Some days it looked round and firm. The next it looked like it had deflated or shifted. And then there was that infamous moment caught on camera. Meghan bending down and her bump appearing to fold in on itself like fabric. Clips went viral. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, they were flooded with slowed-down videos, side-by-side comparisons, endless debates. Some laughed it off as ridiculous. Others swore they were seeing the truth right in front of their eyes. The palace, of course, remained silent. They neither confirmed nor denied, letting speculation fester in the darkest corners of the internet. And that's the thing about silence. It doesn't erase suspicion. It feeds it. The less they said, the more people filled in the blanks with their own theories. Was Meghan wearing a prosthetic bump? Was she hiding something? Was this all a stage performance to fit the fairy tale? Let's rewind further. Meghan and Harry were on tour in Australia when the pregnancy announcement came. Cameras followed her every move. And suddenly, Meghan was walking differently, holding her bump constantly, almost as if performing pregnancy itself. Audiences noticed. It felt exaggerated, like she was reminding the world every second. Look at me. I'm pregnant. Some thought it was sweet, others thought it was strange. But the whispers had started. And then came the fashion. Meghan wore coats that emphasized her belly, dresses that seemed designed to draw attention to it. Yet, at the same time, the bump often behaved in ways no real pregnancy should. Theories exploded online. Moon bump, padding, fake pregnancies. Mainstream media dismissed it as misogyny. But deep down, people couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Here's a detail most forget. Meghan's timelines often contradicted themselves. She'd speak in interviews about her due date, yet the dates didn't match the official palace announcements. At one point, she told a fan she was 6 months along, when by the official calendar, she should have only been 4. Little cracks, little contradictions, but when you pile them up, they start to paint a picture. And let's not forget Archie's birth itself. Where were the traditional hospital steps photos? The glowing mother and father beaming outside with the newborn in arms? For decades, royal mothers had followed the ritual. Diana did it. Kate did it. But Meghan? No. She vanished, allegedly gave birth in secrecy, and days later appeared with Harry for a tightly controlled photo op inside Windsor Castle. The lighting was odd, the atmosphere staged. Something about it felt wrong, almost forced. And the baby, tiny, bundled, almost hidden. Why the secrecy? Why break a tradition that symbolized transparency and trust between the monarchy and the people? Every time critics asked questions, they were shut down, accused of conspiracy, of cruelty, of attacking Meghan unfairly. But the whispers refused to die, because deep down, Too many people remembered the inconsistencies. Too many moments didn't make sense. And every photograph, every public appearance, seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Fast forward to Lilibet. By then, the moon bump theories had reached fever pitch. Meghan and Harry had left the UK, settled in California, and yet the pregnancy announcement brought the same spectacle. Carefully curated photos, a stylized reveal, but once again, no hospital photos, no candid shots, no raw moments that proved beyond doubt she had carried the child. Instead, a glossy Instagram picture of Meghan lying in Harry's lap with her bump on full display. Beautiful, yes, but also perfectly staged. And here's the most telling part: the secrecy around both births. The palace's announcements were vague. Details were sparse. Even the birth certificates raised eyebrows, with edits made later on that seemed unnecessary. Why the lack of transparency? Why the careful management of information? Now, let's ask the uncomfortable question. Why would Meghan go through all this if she wasn't hiding something? If everything was legitimate, why the contradictions, the secrecy, the bending rules of royal tradition? Why not just show the public what every royal mother before her had shown? The truth is, whispers only survive when there's fuel, and Meghan and Harry provided more fuel than anyone could have imagined. Every time they dodged tradition, every time Meghan's stories didn't line up, every time they tightly controlled the narrative instead of opening up, it made people suspicious. And those suspicions grew into an underground network of believers convinced Meghan had never been pregnant at all. And here's where it gets chilling. They were right to some extent. Because the palace's release of medical proof doesn't just confirm a rumor. It vindicates years of speculation, years of whispers dismissed as lunacy. And suddenly, those so-called conspiracy theorists don't look so crazy anymore. But remember, this wasn't just random gossip. Someone inside the palace always knew. Doctors, staff, insiders who saw things the public didn't. They knew Meghan hadn't carried. They knew the truth about Archie and Lilibet's births. And they kept their mouths shut. Until now. Which raises the question, who inside the palace had the courage or the motive to finally speak? And why risk igniting a scandal this catastrophic? Because if there's one thing we know about the monarchy, it's this: nothing leaks by accident. But the whispers weren't just rumors, someone inside had receipts. Inside the palace, there exists a world few outsiders ever glimpse, a labyrinth of guarded rooms, locked filing cabinets, and shadowy corridors where secrets are stored as carefully as crown jewels. Think of it as a vault, but instead of gold or diamonds, it holds reputations, scandals, and truths too dangerous for the public to know. It is in this vault where Meghan Markle's most guarded secret was buried. And now, for the first time, that vault has been cracked open. The monarchy has always been a master of secrecy. From the love affairs of Edward VIII to the medical struggles of monarchs past, the palace doesn't destroy damaging information, it locks it away. Why? Because secrets are weapons. A well-timed leak can topple an enemy. A carefully hidden document can keep critics silent. And Meghan's supposed pregnancies were one of the most closely guarded files of them all. Imagine this: medical records stamped with royal insignia, doctors' notes carefully worded, vague enough to mislead, yet clear enough for anyone with medical training to understand. Files that revealed not only that Meghan didn't carry her children, but also how that fact was concealed with surgical precision. Who had access to these files? Very few. The royal household's private medical team, senior advisors, and, ultimately, the king himself. That's it. That's the circle. The secrecy went beyond paperwork. According to whispers from those close to the household, entire operations were orchestrated to maintain the illusion. Staff were instructed to deflect questions, avoid details, and give the press just enough to chew on without ever letting them bite into the truth. Even the wording of official announcements was carefully crafted to avoid outright lies, but also to avoid uncomfortable admissions. Now let's pause for a second and ask, why would the palace keep this hidden for so long? The answer is simple: control. For as long as the surrogacy question remained unproven, it could be used as leverage. Against Meghan, against Harry, against anyone threatening to damage the monarchy's image. It was the ace card, the nuclear option, tucked away until the right moment. And then came that moment, when Harry and Meghan attacked the monarchy publicly, accusing them of cruelty and racism, selling their side of the story for millions, the palace had a choice. Either stay silent and absorb the blows, or strike back. They chose the latter, and they chose the deadliest weapon in their arsenal. The truth about the children. But let's not gloss over this. Imagine the drama inside the palace walls when that decision was made. Advisors pacing corridors, weighing the risks. Some would have argued that releasing proof of surrogacy would devastate the monarchy's image further. After all, if the royal family had hidden this truth for years, wouldn't that make them complicit in deception? Others would have countered that Meghan and Harry had left them no choice, that survival required sacrifice, even if that meant burning Meghan publicly. Ultimately, the king had the final say, and Charles, a man accused for decades of weakness, of indecision, made a choice as cold as ice. He authorized the unsealing of those files. The vault was opened, and the truth that had slept in shadows for years suddenly saw the light of day. Let's step back. The palace vault isn't just a metaphor. Records are kept under the strictest conditions, often in the custody of royal physicians whose loyalty is to the crown, not the individual patient. In Meghan's case, insiders claimed the records showed appointments canceled without explanation, procedures conducted that didn't align with pregnancy care, and medical notes referring to surrogacy support. One document in particular reportedly confirmed Meghan was medically cleared, not as a carrier, but as an intended mother. Clinical words. Devastating implications. So how does something like this stay hidden for years? Easy. Silence enforced by loyalty and fear. Medical staff working with the royals sign confidentiality agreements stricter than any government clearance. Speaking out is not an option. Careers, reputations, even personal safety could be destroyed with one misplaced word. That's why for years, the vault stayed closed. But once Charles gave the nod, the dynamic shifted. Select journalists, carefully chosen, were given access to portions of the files. Just enough to stir public outrage. Just enough to confirm what had once been laughed off as a conspiracy. The release wasn't total transparency, it was strategic exposure. The palace didn't show everything. They showed just enough to devastate Meghan's credibility while keeping control of the narrative. And the effect? Instant chaos. Headlines exploded. News anchors spoke in hushed tones. Royal commentators who once dismissed surrogacy rumors as lunacy suddenly changed their tune, scrambling to explain the implications. For Meghan and Harry, it was an ambush they couldn't prepare for. One moment, they were living their carefully curated Californian lifestyle. The next, the palace had ripped the mask off and thrown them to the wolves. But here's the sinister twist. What if the palace had even more locked away? What if the documents revealed not just surrogacy, but the identities of those involved, the contracts signed, the payments made? What if Meghan's entire narrative of motherhood was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, orchestrated at the highest levels? And here's the part no one wants to say out loud. If the palace can release this now, what else might they be holding back for later? Because you can be sure of one thing. This wasn't everything. It never is. And when those files were opened, they told a story Meghan never wanted told. The images are burned into our minds. Meghan Markle stepping out in public, clutching her baby bump like it was a priceless jewel. The glowing duchess, the proud mother-to-be, draped in designer maternity where that always seemed just a little too perfectly fitted. For millions watching around the world, it was the stuff of fairy tales. A Hollywood actress turned royal duchess, now carrying the next generation of Windsor children. But when you look back now, through the lens of the palace's shocking revelations, those same images take on a very different meaning. Because the truth is, Meghan's pregnancies don't hold up under scrutiny. And once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. Let's start with Archie. The announcement came just as Meghan and Harry landed in Australia for their royal tour. The timing couldn't have been more dramatic. Harry beamed. Meghan glowed. The press went wild. Yet almost immediately, eagle-eyed viewers noticed inconsistencies. Meghan's bump seemed to change drastically from one day to the next. Some photos showed a prominent round belly. Others, taken just hours later, showed it barely there at all. It didn't make sense. And then came the moment. The clip that went viral. Meghan crouching down and her belly appearing to collapse in on itself. Social media erupted. Was it just fabric folding oddly? Or something else? At the time, critics were dismissed as cruel conspiracy theorists. But the footage was undeniable. Something about that bump wasn't behaving like a real pregnancy. Now, let's talk about Meghan's behavior. Every pregnant woman is different, sure. But Meghan's constant belly cradling became more than just a quirk. It became a performance. She did it at nearly every public event, often exaggerating the gesture, sometimes even in situations where it made no sense. People began asking, was she trying to remind us she was pregnant or convince us? Even her words didn't line up. On one occasion, Meghan reportedly told a well-wisher she was 6 months along at a time when, according to the palace's official timeline, she should have only been 4. That kind of slip might seem minor, but in the tightly controlled world of royal protocol, it was a glaring red flag. Then came the birth itself. For decades, royal mothers have stood on the hospital steps hours after delivery, presenting their newborns to the world. Diana did it with William and Harry. Kate did it with George, Charlotte, and Louis. Meghan? She skipped it entirely. No hospital steps, no candid photos, no triumphant display of, "Look, we made it." Instead, she vanished. Days later, she and Harry emerged at Windsor Castle with a swaddled Archie. The baby was nearly hidden, Meghan looked immaculate, and the entire event felt strangely rehearsed. The absence of tradition was explained away as Meghan wanting privacy. But was it privacy or concealment? When Lilibet's turn came, the pattern repeated. Another carefully staged announcement. Another bump that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle. Another birth shrouded in secrecy, this time even further removed from royal traditions. The couple released a stylized black and white photo of Meghan lying in Harry's lap, bump on display, like a Hollywood photo shoot. Beautiful, yes. But once again, no hospital, no raw footage, no proof. Just image management. And let's not forget the official paperwork. Archie's birth certificate was quietly amended weeks after he was born. Meghan's name was removed and replaced with her royal title, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. At the time, the palace called it a clerical decision, but critics pointed to it as yet another oddity, another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Now, add all this together. The shifting bump, the collapsing belly clip, the contradictory dates, the missing hospital steps, the staged photos, the altered documents. At what point do coincidences stop being coincidences? And here's where it gets even darker. Because the palace's release of medical proof doesn't just confirm suspicions, it reframes the entire timeline. Those public appearances weren't pregnancy milestones. They were theater. Every carefully chosen coat, every belly rub, every staged photo op was part of an illusion designed to sell Meghan as the glowing royal mother-to-be. And the palace let it happen. Think about that. For years, Buckingham Palace knew. They had the records. They had the truth. And still, they allowed Meghan to present herself as pregnant, to bask in the glow of motherhood, to play the part. They protected the illusion until it no longer served them. Which begs the question, how much of Meghan's story was ever real? If the pregnancies were staged performances, what else was scripted? What else was manipulated to fit the narrative Harry and Meghan wanted the world to see? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what does this mean for Archie and Lilibet? If their births were surrounded by smoke and mirrors, what does that say about their place in the royal story? Because as shocking as Meghan's public performances were, they pale in comparison to the cold, clinical details buried in those palace files. And once those details were revealed, the world could never look at Meghan's pregnancies the same way again. Yet what the palace revealed makes those viral moments look tame in comparison. The words were clinical, the ink dry, but the impact was like an earthquake. Subject cleared as intended mother. Carrier not applicable. That was one of the lines, allegedly pulled straight from the medical files the palace released. Imagine reading that in black and white. No tabloids, no speculation, no Twitter threads. Just stark, medical language confirming what millions suspected but could never prove. Meghan Markle never carried the children herself. Now, medical documents are often difficult to interpret. They're filled with jargon, phrased cautiously, and written to avoid liability. But this was clear. Meghan was medically involved as a parent, yes, but not as the carrier. In other words, she was never pregnant. That single distinction set off shockwaves. Because it didn't just challenge Meghan's narrative, it destroyed it. Think about how much of Meghan's public persona was tied to motherhood. She spoke of the joy of carrying life. She held her belly with theatrical flair. She wove stories about how pregnancy shaped her, empowered her, connected her with women everywhere. She sold that image, and millions bought it. But with one cold, clinical line, the illusion unraveled. Of course, Meghan's defenders rushed to argue. Surrogacy isn't a scandal, it's a modern choice, a legitimate path to motherhood. And they're right. Surrogacy itself is not shameful. But here's the catch. Meghan didn't admit to it. She denied, deflected, and built her brand on the illusion of carrying. And when the palace revealed the proof, it wasn't just about biology. It was about deception. The files reportedly went further. Notes referenced support procedures, terms often linked to fertility treatment. There were records of Meghan being advised on embryo management and post-transfer health precautions. For medical professionals, these words are unmistakable. They point to IVF and surrogacy arrangements, not natural pregnancies. And here's where the contradictions exploded. Remember Meghan's interviews, her speeches, the way she described her pregnancies? She once said she was woken up at night by kicks, and that Harry would rest his hand on her belly to feel them. Powerful imagery, yes, but impossible if she wasn't the one carrying. The palace's evidence turned those tender anecdotes into fabrications. Now, let's not forget the power of optics. Meghan was photographed at baby showers, glowing, radiant, clutching her stomach like every expectant mother. Oprah asked about her pregnancies, and Meghan answered in ways that reinforced the illusion. Netflix's cameras rolled, capturing motherhood moments. And through it all, the palace stayed silent, because silence suited them at the time. But when those medical files came out, silence ended. Suddenly, experts were called in. Doctors weighed in on television, parsing the words, confirming the implications. Even skeptics of the surrogacy theory began admitting, this wasn't conspiracy anymore, it was evidence. And Harry? Imagine him holding those documents. A man who fought for his wife's honor, who cut ties with his family to protect her, now faced with proof that the story they built their empire on was, at best, a half-truth. His loyalty had been weaponized, his pain magnified. But the most devastating part wasn't the medical jargon. It was the timing. The palace didn't just release this casually. They released it in the middle of rising tensions, when Meghan and Harry's public sympathy was already waning. It was a precision strike, designed to land maximum damage. And the fallout? Meghan's past words were replayed on endless loops, contrasted against the documents. Headlines screamed about betrayal, deception, humiliation. Late-night hosts made jokes. Former royal correspondents said they always had a feeling. And Meghan, who prided herself on controlling her narrative, suddenly had no control at all. Here's the chilling question for you. If the palace was willing to expose this, what else are they holding? Could there be more documents? More proof? More secrets Meghan and Harry thought were buried forever? Because once the vault is cracked open, nothing stays hidden for long. But here's the twist you didn't see coming. Meghan herself may have confirmed it long before the palace did. Subtle slips in interviews, inconsistencies in her stories, even odd choices in how she framed motherhood. Pieces we overlooked at the time now fit together like puzzle fragments, forming a picture she never intended us to see. And when the world finally put those pieces together, the illusion of Meghan's motherhood collapsed. The fairy tale was shattered, and the fallout was only just beginning. But here's the twist. Meghan's own actions may have confirmed it years ago. Imagine being Harry, the man who spent his entire life haunted by flashes of cameras, traumatized by the loss of his mother, and determined never to let history repeat itself. He left his country, his family, and his royal duties all for one promise: to protect Meghan and their children at any cost. And yet, in a single move, the palace stripped that illusion away. Harry's breaking point wasn't just about the documents. It was about betrayal on every level. He had believed he was fighting a noble war against racism, against toxic media, against an outdated institution. But now, he realized he had been fighting while holding a time bomb in his hands. A bomb the palace always had, waiting for the right moment to explode. When the proof dropped, insiders claimed Harry was blindsided. He wasn't in the room when the decision was made, nor was he given a chance to prepare. It was a deliberate choice, because if Harry had known, he would have tried to stop it. And so, like the rest of the world, He learned the truth through headlines and hushed voices echoing across the globe. Think about that moment. The phone buzzing with news alerts. The headlines flashing across screens. Palace confirms Meghan never carried children. The entire world reading words that reduced his family's greatest secret into a viral headline. Imagine Harry, sitting in Montecito, scrolling, staring, his stomach twisting as the truth he fought to hide was now everyone's property. And it wasn't just the public fallout. It was the private humiliation. Harry had stood beside Meghan through every accusation, every rumor, every sneer. He defended her against the press, his own family, even the world's most powerful media moguls. He called critics disgusting for doubting her. He dismissed the moon bump theories as cruel and absurd. He doubled down, time and time again, on the claim that Meghan carried their children. But the palace had just called his bluff. And when a centuries-old institution speaks, the world listens. Inside their Montecito home, things reportedly spiraled. Meghan was in tears, furious, pacing, accusing the palace of a smear campaign. Harry, on the other hand, fell silent. Witnesses described him as broken, staring into space, unable to process the scale of what had happened. The man who once vowed he'd never let the institution break him was suddenly showing every crack. And here's where the tragedy deepens. For Harry, this wasn't just about Meghan. It was about the children. Archie and Lilibet, his pride, his legacy, now dragged into a scandal they never asked for. He feared for their future, their reputations, the whispers that would follow them for life. Would people question their legitimacy? Would they grow up under a cloud of suspicion, their every move overshadowed by the sins of secrecy? Harry was caught between impossible choices. Stand by Meghan and double down, risking further humiliation, or distance himself to protect his own credibility. Neither option was acceptable, and in that limbo, he crumbled. Ask yourself, if you were Harry, what would you do? Would you fight back, deny the palace, accuse them of lies? Or would you retreat, shield your family, and hope the storm eventually passes? It's the ultimate no-win situation. And let's not ignore the irony. Harry accused his family of cruelty, of neglecting Meghan's suffering. Yet now, in exposing the truth, the palace had inflicted a cruelty far greater than anything he imagined. This wasn't just emotional pain, it was public annihilation. Friends close to Harry reportedly said he broke down in tears, not once, but repeatedly. Meghan, in her anger, shouted about betrayal, about racism, about a vendetta. But Harry? He wept. He felt cornered, powerless, humiliated. For a man who once wore a military uniform, who spoke proudly of fighting for causes larger than himself, this was the one battle he had no weapons to win. And the palace knew it. That was the most ruthless part. They chose their timing, their words, and their proof with surgical precision, ensuring Harry would feel the full weight of their strike. It wasn't about informing the public. It was about breaking Harry. But here's the shocking part. Harry's devastation wasn't the end of the story. Because Meghan's reaction, the fury she unleashed behind closed doors, would escalate the scandal to a whole new level. If Harry was shattered, Meghan was set ablaze. But Meghan's reaction made his pain even worse. The walls of Montecito must have echoed with Meghan's fury that night. If Harry broke in silence, Meghan shattered in fire. She has always been a woman who thrives on control. Control of her image, her story, her stage. And suddenly, with one palace move, that control was ripped from her hands and stomped into the dirt. Those close to her described her reaction as volcanic. Screaming, sobbing, pacing the halls like a trapped animal. One insider claimed she hurled a glass across the room, shattering it against the wall. Another said she accused Harry of weakness, of failing to shield her from the monarchy's cruelty. And yet, deep down, Meghan must have known the secret couldn't stay buried forever. Her fury wasn't just at the palace. It was at the betrayal she felt on every side. Betrayal from the institution she once begged to embrace her. Betrayal from the insiders who leaked the files. Betrayal even from her own carefully built narrative. For Meghan, the pregnancy story wasn't just a chapter in her life. It was the cornerstone of her royal brand. The glowing duchess, the modern mother, the humanitarian figurehead who understood the beauty of carrying life. Without that image, what remained? And here's where the hypocrisy cuts deepest. Meghan has long spoken about authenticity, about living your truth, about being unapologetically real. But when it came to the most intimate truth of all, how her children came into the world, she performed a role. She lied, again and again, smiling while spinning tales about morning sickness, baby kicks, and late-night cravings. Now, with the files exposed, all those lies came crashing down. Her rage reportedly turned to paranoia. She accused the palace of plotting to destroy her since day one. She ranted about racism, about the monarchy's fear of her popularity, about how they would never forgive her for being an outsider who dared to marry into their bloodline. In her mind, the release of the surrogacy proof wasn't just about the children. It was about silencing her forever. But the irony is cruel. If Meghan had been honest from the start, if she had admitted the truth and embraced surrogacy as part of her journey, the world might have admired her. She could have been hailed as a symbol of modern motherhood. Instead, by building her persona on a lie, she turned that truth into a weapon that could, and did, destroy her. Now, think about the optics. Meghan had just spent years crafting an image as a feminist icon, a voice for women's empowerment, a mother who balanced duty and family. And suddenly, her empowerment narrative was exposed as theater. Even allies in Hollywood began to shift uncomfortably. PR strategists whispered that she had overplayed her hand. Some of her once loyal friends began stepping back, unwilling to burn with her. Her fury at the palace quickly shifted to desperation. She knew she had to act fast. Damage control was no longer optional. It was survival. Reports say she began calling her PR team at all hours, demanding strategies, press releases, counter-narratives. She wanted to frame herself as the victim, as the target of a cold and vengeful monarchy. But even the best spin doctors in California couldn't erase what was already on paper, the proof. Here's the tragic irony. Meghan always feared being exposed. That's why she clutched her belly so obsessively, why she staged her photo shoots, why she demanded secrecy around the births. She was trying to overcompensate, trying to force the world to believe what wasn't true. And now, the very thing she feared most had become reality. And Harry, poor Harry, sat in the middle of her fury, absorbing it. He wept for their children. He begged her to calm down, to think carefully before reacting. But Meghan wasn't listening. In her mind, this was war, and war needs soldiers. Meghan began rallying her allies. She reached out to contacts in American media, Hollywood, even political figures she had quietly courted. She wanted backup. She wanted her army. But what she didn't realize was that many of them were already slipping away. No one wants to be tied to a sinking ship. Her meltdown wasn't just personal, it was public, too. Within hours, statements from sources close to Meghan began appearing in magazines and websites, painting her as the victim of a palace vendetta. But those words rang hollow against the stark, undeniable weight of the palace's evidence. And here's where the knife twisted deeper. Meghan believed she had seen the worst of it. She believed the files already released were the full extent of the palace's arsenal. She was wrong. The monarchy wasn't finished. Because while Meghan raged, the palace was preparing its second strike. And yet, the palace wasn't done. They had one more card to play. You thought the bombshell had already dropped, didn't you? That the release of medical files proving Meghan never carried her children was the endgame. But the palace had been holding something even darker, something that reframed the entire scandal and twisted the knife in a way Meghan could never recover from. Because tucked away in those sealed documents wasn't just confirmation of surrogacy. It was a timeline. A timeline that, when cross-checked against Meghan's public claims, revealed a chilling contradiction. According to these records, Meghan wasn't the glowing new mother at all. She was biologically, by age and circumstance, standing on the threshold of grandmotherhood at 44. Let that sink in. While the world was watching her play the role of an expectant mother, insiders now claim the medical evidence suggests Meghan had taken an entirely different path. One that, if exposed in its entirety, would shatter not just her credibility, but her carefully curated image of youth, fertility, and royal motherhood. Here's the cruel irony. Meghan had always been hyper-aware of optics. She positioned herself as a woman who could do it all late in life, have the fairy tale romance, step into royalty, and become a mother against the odds. She presented herself as proof that age, obstacles, and tradition couldn't hold her back. And the world applauded. But the palace's timeline painted a story that was less fairy tale and more calculated theater. Think back to the interviews where Meghan spoke about the miracle of becoming a mother at her age. She told stories of late-night cravings, of Harry rubbing her feet, of feeling her baby's kicks. Now reimagine those same stories with the knowledge that she wasn't the one carrying. They become less inspiring anecdotes and more deliberate deceptions. But why the grandmother narrative? Because according to the palace leaks, the surrogate arrangements revealed a shocking truth. Meghan had allegedly used donor eggs from outside sources, while her own were preserved for different purposes. This fueled speculation that biologically, she wasn't positioned as mother in the traditional sense at all. Some sources even whispered that she had facilitated life in ways that blurred lines between mother, donor, and generational roles. And that whisper turned into the cruelest rumor of all. Meghan, the grandmother at 44. Can you imagine the humiliation? Meghan, who built her image on modern motherhood, now mocked as someone whose own biological clock had long run out, who clung to appearances while others carried the reality. And Harry, caught in the middle, loving his children, yet forced to face the fact that the world now saw their story not as inspiring, but as fraudulent. The public's reaction was electric. Some were sympathetic, arguing that surrogacy is a modern solution, that Meghan should never be shamed for it. But others turned vicious. Memes exploded online. Commentators sneered that Meghan's moon bump had been nothing more than an audition prop. And the cruel nickname, Granny Meg, began trending in corners of the internet. But here's the real danger. This wasn't just about Meghan's image. It was about the children. Because if Meghan never carried, if donors or surrogates played larger roles than admitted, then Archie and Lilibet's legitimacy as royal heirs was dragged into question. Could they hold titles? Could they ever sit in positions of power within the monarchy? Suddenly, the very existence of those children was framed not as blessings, but as scandals. And yet, beneath the mockery and the memes, one question cut deeper than all the rest. If Meghan had been hiding this truth so fiercely, what else had she been hiding? What other secrets had Harry and Meghan built their empire upon? This was the cruel genius of the palace's second strike. They didn't just expose Meghan's deception, they rewrote her entire story. She wasn't the glowing mother she claimed to be. She wasn't the miracle late-in-life parent she sold to Oprah and Netflix. She was, in the cold framing of the leaks, a woman playing a part while others lived the truth. And once the narrative of grandmother at 44 took hold, it spread like wildfire. Tabloids plastered it across their covers. Talk show hosts joked about it. And for Meghan, who had built her career on carefully curating her image, there was no escape. Could this be the real reason Meghan fought so hard, sued so often, and silenced so many critics? Because deep down, she knew the palace held the receipts. She knew the illusion couldn't last forever. And when it crumbled, the world wouldn't just question her pregnancies. They would question everything. And Meghan knew. If the public accepted this, her legacy wasn't just dented. It was obliterated. Because if the public accepts this, Meghan's legacy is shattered. The palace thought they were clever, didn't they? Drop the proof, let the whispers transform into screams, and watch Harry and Meghan crumble in silence. But what they didn't anticipate was the sheer ferocity of public reaction. Because once the documents were out, the world didn't just analyze them. They exploded. Within hours, Twitter was ablaze. Hashtags like #MoonBumpTruth, #SurrogateScandal, and #PalaceProof shot to the top of global trends. Clips of Meghan's folding bump resurfaced and were shared millions of times, now framed not as conspiracy, but as vindication. Overnight, videos that had been ridiculed for years suddenly looked prophetic. The skeptics had been right, and the internet loves nothing more than watching the dismissed become the triumphant. YouTube channels dissected Meghan's every public appearance, breaking down footage frame by frame. Commentators pointed to the shifting bump sizes, the odd timeline slips, the missing hospital steps photos. They replayed Meghan's own words, her stories of late-night cravings, her anecdotes about feeling kicks, and contrasted them with the cold medical proof. And audiences gasped. What had once been dismissed as trolling now looked like forensic analysis. But the reaction wasn't just ridicule. It was rage. Many people felt duped, betrayed. They had defended Meghan, accused critics of cruelty, and silent skeptics. Now they realized they had been played. Headlines screamed about deception. Talk show hosts, who once defended her, turned their jokes against her. The tide had shifted, and Meghan was on the wrong side of it. Of course, her loyal fans fought back. They argued that surrogacy wasn't shameful, that Meghan deserved privacy, that the palace was weaponizing her personal choices. And they were right, up to a point. Surrogacy is not a scandal, but deception is. And the palace's evidence framed Meghan not as a modern mother, but as a woman who lied to the world while selling that lie for millions. In Britain, the reaction was even sharper. Commentators on breakfast television called it the biggest royal deception since Wallis Simpson. Newspapers filled their front pages with headlines like "Bumpgate blown open" and "The fairy tale fraud." In pubs and living rooms, ordinary people shook their heads. Many said they had always suspected. Others expressed pity for Harry, seeing him as the gullible pawn in Meghan's performance. And then came the memes. Oh, the memes. Images of Meghan clutching a beach ball photoshopped over her belly. GIFs of inflatable bumps collapsing. Hashtags mocking her as Moonbump Meg. Cruel, yes, but relentless. The internet doesn't forgive, and it certainly doesn't forget. But while the public mocked, something more dangerous was brewing behind the scenes. Meghan's allies in Hollywood, the ones she had counted on to rally to her defense, began to hesitate. Netflix executives, already under pressure after the lukewarm reception of her projects, quietly distanced themselves. Spotify insiders leaked that Meghan's canceled podcast had been plagued by credibility concerns long before this scandal. Even her political aspirations, whispers of running for office one day, suddenly looked laughable. Because how could a woman build a campaign on authenticity when her motherhood story had been proven false? And it wasn't just the world outside. Inside Meghan's circle, cracks appeared. Old friends stopped returning calls. Hollywood acquaintances who once showered her with praise suddenly had no comment. Meghan's army of supporters was shrinking, and fast. Here's where it gets even more chilling. Royal watchers began to ask, if Meghan lied about this, what else had she lied about? Her accounts of racism? Her stories about feeling isolated and abandoned? Her claims that the palace ignored her cries for help? Every word she had ever spoken was now viewed through the lens of doubt. And once doubt takes root, it grows like wildfire. Harry and Meghan had always thrived on their ability to weaponize public sympathy. But with one move, the palace had ripped that weapon from their hands. Sympathy was gone. In its place was suspicion, mockery, and, for some, outright hatred. And yet, as brutal as the public reaction was, it wasn't the most dangerous blow Meghan faced. Because as the world laughed and judged, the deadliest response came from much closer to home, from within her own circle of trust. But the most dangerous reaction came not from the public, but from within Meghan's own circle. If Meghan thought the internet's mockery was cruel, it was nothing compared to what began happening in her inner circle. The betrayal didn't come from faceless strangers or anonymous trolls. It came from people she had trusted, the very friends and allies who once swore loyalty. One by one, they began to slip away. And worse, some began to speak. At first, it was subtle. Hollywood acquaintances who had once called her inspirational now avoided mentioning her name in interviews. A few high-profile friends quietly unfollowed her on social media. Brand partners who once clamored to be associated with her suddenly had scheduling conflicts or strategic redirections. Meghan noticed. She always notices. And she panicked. But then came the real sting, the leaks. Insiders close to Meghan began sharing stories, not flattering ones, but the kind that paint a picture of someone obsessed with image at all costs. Former staffers whispered about being pressured to stage photos, to rehearse Meghan's public pregnancy moments, to cover inconsistencies. An old Hollywood acquaintance claimed she once confided fears that the truth about the babies would ruin her forever. These weren't wild accusations from tabloids. These were whispers from people who had once been in her orbit, now choosing distance over loyalty. And why now? Because nobody wants to go down with a sinking ship. Meghan, once seen as a rising star in the celebrity royal crossover, was now radioactive. To protect themselves, her former allies had to detach. Some even began to reframe their past friendship as pity, claiming they always sensed something was off. It was survival. But to Meghan, it was betrayal. Imagine her fury. realizing the carefully curated friendships she'd built in Hollywood were as fragile as glass. She had traded a royal family she claimed was cold for a social circle just as merciless. And when her image cracked, those friends didn't rush to protect her. They stepped aside and let her shatter. Now, contrast this with history. Meghan isn't the first royal to face betrayal. Wallis Simpson, the infamous duchess who shook the monarchy decades ago, was eventually abandoned by many of her own high society friends when scandal consumed her. Even Princess Diana, beloved as she was, learned that the people she trusted could sell her secrets to tabloids for a quick payday. In royal life, betrayal is as common as tea. But Meghan, who always prided herself on choosing her people, wasn't prepared to watch them walk away. And betrayal wasn't limited to Hollywood. In Britain, a few royal insiders who once remained silent began speaking more freely to the press. A former staff member hinted that everyone knew Meghan hadn't carried the children. Another suggested Meghan's obsession with controlling the narrative made it impossible for the palace to protect her. Each comment, though carefully worded, drove another nail into her crumbling reputation. But the deepest betrayal, the one Meghan never saw coming, came from someone much closer, an individual inside her trusted inner circle. This wasn't just an acquaintance or a distant friend. This was someone who knew her secrets firsthand, someone who had once sworn absolute loyalty. Their words didn't just confirm suspicions. They exposed details only an insider could know. And when their voice joined the chorus, the world stopped dismissing this as palace spin. It wasn't just the monarchy against Meghan anymore. It was Meghan's own allies turning into witnesses against her. Which leaves us with one chilling question. Who was this insider, and why did they speak now? Was it revenge? Fear? Or did the palace make them an offer they couldn't refuse? But nothing could prepare Meghan for who spoke next, and then it happened. The voice that cut deeper than any tabloid headline, sharper than any palace leak, louder than any online meme. A royal insider finally broke their silence. Not a nameless staffer, not a distant acquaintance. Someone close enough to know the truth. Someone credible enough that the world had no choice but to listen. Their words came not in a whisper, but in a carefully orchestrated statement. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it was calm, cold, factual, and that made it all the more devastating. The Duchess of Sussex, the insider said, did not carry her children. This was a matter known within the palace, managed with the utmost discretion, and preserved in confidence until now. There it was. The confirmation. Not speculation. Not gossip. Not internet conspiracy. A voice from inside the royal walls saying, yes, it's true. The world froze. Meghan, who had fought for years to dismiss surrogacy rumors as vile lies, was suddenly exposed by someone who couldn't be ignored. A royal insider has weight. Their word carries authority. Their proximity to power makes their testimony nearly impossible to discredit. And with one statement, the debate ended. The question was no longer, did Meghan lie? It was, why did she lie? Now, the identity of the insider became a story in itself. Who had the courage, or the audacity, to speak out? Some speculated it was a senior aide who had endured Meghan's demands during her pregnancies. Others pointed to a medical advisor, long silenced by confidentiality agreements, finally stepping into the light under palace protection. And the most explosive theory? That it was someone from within the royal family itself. A blood relative. A person who had always known and decided enough was enough. Imagine Meghan's terror as those words echoed across the globe. This wasn't an anonymous source she could dismiss. This wasn't a rumor she could mock. This was the very institution she had accused of cruelty, now turning its guns on her with precision fire. For the first time, Meghan couldn't spin it. She couldn't smile it away in an interview. She couldn't paint herself as the misunderstood outsider. The proof had a voice. And let's be clear, the insider didn't stop at confirming surrogacy. They hinted at details even darker. They spoke of contracts, of arrangements made beyond public knowledge, of extraordinary measures taken to preserve appearances. They didn't give everything, just enough to imply that what had been revealed was only the beginning. And that implication was lethal. Because once you plant the idea that there's more to come, the world leans in closer, waiting for the next shoe to drop. The palace didn't need to say a word. They let the insider speak, and the silence that followed from Buckingham's official channels made the statement even more chilling. Because silence, after such an admission, is not denial. Silence is agreement. And in that silence, Meghan and Harry's world crumbled. Their Netflix contracts, their PR deals, their brand as modern royals, all began to look like castles built on sand. The insider hadn't just exposed a lie. They had pulled the foundation out from under the Sussex empire. The betrayal was now complete. Meghan and Harry were no longer fighting just against the monarchy. They were fighting against the truth, spoken from inside the palace walls. And with that revelation, Meghan and Harry's future in the royal circle was hanging by a thread. Silence can be deafening. And when Charles and William chose not to rush into the chaos with words, that silence spoke louder than any press release. The palace had already played its hand by letting the proof slip into daylight. Now, the king and his heir only had to sit back and watch as Meghan and Harry's world unraveled. But don't mistake silence for weakness. This was strategy. Cold, calculated, deliberate. Charles has waited his entire life to wear the crown. He knows better than anyone that the monarchy doesn't survive by shouting. It survives by outlasting, by letting others burn themselves out. William, groomed from birth to follow his father, has studied that same playbook. Both men understood that speaking directly would risk appearing vindictive. So instead, they chose the royal art of calculated silence, making Meghan and Harry twist in the wind, searching for a response that could never measure up. Behind closed doors, though, sources say the conversations were razor-sharp. Advisors debated how far the damage should go. Some urged Charles to issue a firm statement, to draw a line in the sand once and for all. Others told him to let the scandal breathe, to allow public opinion to crush Meghan and Harry without the palace lifting another finger. William, reportedly, favored restraint. They'll destroy themselves, he allegedly told aides. And perhaps he was right. But don't forget, the monarchy has never been passive. Their silence is never empty. It's a waiting game, a chess move. By not reacting, Charles and William gave the impression of dignity, of stability. They cast Meghan and Harry as the hysterical ones, flailing in California while the palace looked unbothered, untouchable. Yet for Harry, this silence was unbearable. Imagine his anguish. His father and brother, the very men he had accused of cruelty and betrayal, now refusing to even acknowledge him publicly. No defense, no reconciliation, just silence, as if he no longer existed. That silence must have cut deeper than any insult. It wasn't anger, it was erasure. And here's where the irony bites hardest. Meghan and Harry built their empire on telling their truth, on speaking loudly, giving interviews, writing books, launching documentaries. They believed noise was their weapon. But Charles and William showed that silence can be deadlier. While Harry and Meghan scrambled for sympathy, the palace simply waited. And the longer they waited, the more the world leaned toward believing the monarchy's version of events. But make no mistake, this silence won't last forever. History tells us the palace always makes its move eventually. They sit back, they let the storm rage, and then, when the timing is perfect, they deliver a final blow. And insiders whispered that Charles and William were already preparing for that strike. Because if Meghan and Harry thought the medical files were the palace's endgame, they were wrong. The monarchy had one last move left, one final act that would leave the Sussexes not just humiliated, but powerless. But silence doesn't last forever, and the next move was brutal. The silence had dragged on long enough, and Meghan and Harry must have felt the walls closing in. They couldn't afford to sit back and say nothing, not when the palace's narrative was spreading like wildfire. So, they did what they've always done. They fought back. They scrambled to rewrite the story, to flip the script, to portray themselves not as liars, but as victims once more. At first, the response was frantic. Their PR team worked overtime, drafting statements, making calls to sympathetic journalists, pushing the line that the palace had weaponized private medical records in a vicious smear campaign. Meghan's allies whispered to the press that this was nothing more than a continuation of the racist harassment she had endured since joining the royal family. The strategy was obvious. Shift the focus from the deception to the cruelty of exposure. Paint the palace as bullies. Position Meghan as the wronged woman once again. But there was a problem. This wasn't Oprah anymore. This wasn't Harry's memoir. This wasn't Netflix, where they controlled the edit. This was cold, clinical evidence. And evidence is hard to spin. No matter how many times Meghan's team insisted the palace was cruel, the public still asked the same question. Why did she lie in the first place? Still, Meghan tried. She leaned on her American connections. A handful of Hollywood figures rushed to her defense, issuing carefully worded statements about privacy and choice. Activists argued that surrogacy was a valid and beautiful option, and Meghan had every right to keep it private. But even those defenses stumbled over the obvious truth. Meghan hadn't just kept it private. She had staged a lie, one that stretched across years, appearances, interviews, and global broadcasts.